The frozen city lay beneath a shroud of snow and ruin, where gun smoke mingled with bitter cold, and death arrived in silence. She had been known only by a mocking title, the wife of the useless one. Her husband was despised until the day he fell in a senseless attack. No one thought the quiet woman standing behind the crowd could even hold a rifle. Even less did they imagine that from an ice-covered building overlooking the battlefield, a female sniper would make an entire enemy squad vanish in silence, forcing everyone to see her with different eyes. The city had been beautiful once. Margaret Reynolds remembered photographs from before the war, images her husband Daniel had shown her during their first winter together. Wide boulevards lined with trees, glass towers reflecting summer sunlight, children playing in fountains that now stood shattered and silent. That city was gone. What remained was a corpse of concrete and steel wrapped in perpetual winter. Snow fell in thick curtains that never seemed to stop, accumulating in drifts that reached second-story windows. The streets had become narrow canyons carved through white, barely wide enough for a single vehicle to pass. Most buildings stood gutted, their windows blown out like empty eye sockets, their interiors blackened by fire or simply frozen solid. The wind never stopped. It screamed through the skeletal remains of high-rises, howling through empty corridors and stairwells, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning metal and something worse, something organic that no one wanted to name. On clear days when the snow paused its descent, you could see for blocks. The vista was always the same. Destruction layered upon destruction, a maze of rubble and ruin that stretched to every horizon. Margaret's unit occupied what had once been a transit station on the city's eastern edge. The massive concrete structure had survived mostly intact, its thick walls and underground levels providing shelter from both the cold and enemy fire. 200 soldiers lived in the warren of tunnels and platforms below ground, emerging only when necessary to man defensive positions or run supply lines through the deadly streets above. She had arrived here 8 months ago with Daniel, both of them assigned to the 47th Urban Defense Battalion. Daniel worked in logistics, managing the flow of ammunition and rations through the underground network. Margaret had no official assignment. She was simply there, one of a handful of civilian spouses who had been unable or unwilling to evacuate when the fighting reached this sector. The other soldiers ignored her. When they acknowledged her existence at all, it was usually with sideways glances or muttered comments just loud enough for her to hear. She occupied a corner of the storage level, a space barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker, separated from the main area by a hanging tarp that provided the illusion of privacy. The temperature inside the station never rose above freezing. Everyone wore multiple layers, their breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. The walls wept with condensation that froze into intricate patterns of ice. At night she could hear the building itself groaning, steel and concrete contracting in the savage cold. Through the broken skylight 4 levels above, she could see the gray sky, perpetually threatening more snow. The sound of distant gunfire was constant, an irregular drumbeat that marked the hours. Sometimes it was far away, a muffled crackle like breaking ice. Other times it came from nearby streets, sharp cracks that made everyone flinch and reach for weapons. This was her world now, cold, gray, waiting. Margaret stood near the entrance to the storage level, watching soldiers prepare for a patrol. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times, checking weapons, distributing ammunition, adjusting gear. She recognized most of them by sight, if not by name. They never looked at her directly. Lieutenant Harrison, the patrol leader, was briefing his squad near the stairwell leading up to street level. He was a lean man with a perpetual scowl, his face weathered beyond his 30 years. His voice carried across the space, detailing their route and objectives. A simple reconnaissance check 3 blocks north, report enemy movement, return before dark. "Where's Reynolds?" Harrison called out, not looking up from his map. "Here, sir." Daniel emerged from the supply area carrying a case of ammunition. He was shorter than most of the soldiers, slightly built, with thin wrists that seemed too delicate for the weight he carried. His uniform hung loose on his frame. "You're late," Harrison said flatly. "Sorry, sir, had to locate the—" "I don't care. Next time, have it ready." Harrison took the case without looking at Daniel. Anyone else would have been docked rations. The soldiers nearby smirked. One of them, a thick-necked corporal named Stevens, muttered something that made two others laugh. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She had heard variations of it before. Daniel's face flushed, but he said nothing. He nodded and turned to leave, catching Margaret's eye for just a moment. She saw the hurt there, carefully masked but still visible to her. He had never been a soldier by nature. The war had simply found him, like it had found everyone. Margaret watched the patrol file up the stairs, their boots echoing in the cold space. Harrison led them out without another word. The heavy door closed behind them with a metallic boom that reverberated through the station. In the silence that followed, Margaret heard Stephen's voice drifting back from the upper level. "Can't believe we trust our ammo count to that pencil pusher." "At least he's useful for something," another voice replied. "More than his wife." Laughter, cutting and casual. Then the sound of footsteps fading as they moved into the frozen streets above. Margaret stood motionless, her face expressionless. She had learned not to react. Reaction gave them satisfaction, and she would give them nothing. Instead, she memorized voices, matched them to faces, filed everything away in the methodical manner she had learned long ago. Daniel returned to the storage area, moving with the careful precision he brought to all his tasks. He began organizing the remaining supply crates, rotating stock, checking inventory. Margaret joined him without speaking. They worked side by side in practiced silence, their breath mingling in clouds of vapor. "You heard," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I always hear." "It doesn't matter." "I know." But it did matter. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly as he updated the inventory log. It mattered very much. The constant erosion of small humiliations, the daily reminder that he was viewed as lesser, that they both were. Margaret's hand found his, their fingers intertwining for just a moment. Cold skin against cold skin, a brief connection in the frozen world. "I'm here," she said quietly. "I know." Above them, muffled by concrete and distance, the sound of gunfire intensified. Another skirmish in the endless gray. The war ground on, indifferent to rank or respect, or the quiet suffering of people trying to survive it. Margaret looked up at the frozen skylight, at the snow beginning to fall again in heavy flakes. Somewhere in this dead city, enemies moved through ruins identical to these, pursuing objectives she didn't understand in a conflict that seemed to have no end. She thought about the rifle locked in their footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath clothing and personal items. Daniel didn't know about it. No one did. It was a secret she had carried for months, ever since they arrived in this frozen hell. Not yet, she told herself, not yet. The time would come. The disdain had begun the day they arrived. Margaret remembered standing in the processing line with Daniel, both of them clutching assignment papers, their few possessions stuffed into battered duffel bags. A sergeant had glanced at Daniel's medical exemption waiver, his lip curling. "Another clerk," he had said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Just what we need. More people to count bullets while real soldiers fire them." Daniel had said nothing, accepting the assignment with quiet dignity. But Margaret had seen others watching, filing the moment away. First impressions were everything in military culture, and Daniel's first impression had been weakness. It didn't help that he looked the part. At 5'7", he was shorter than most of the soldiers. His frame was slight, his hands soft from years working in university administration before the war. He had terrible eyesight, corrected by thick glasses that were perpetually fogging in the cold. When he walked, there was a slight limp from an old childhood injury, nothing that prevented him from functioning, but enough to mark him as different. The mockery started small. Forgotten supply requests, equipment that mysteriously went missing from his assigned storage area. His work was constantly questioned, double-checked, his numbers verified by others as if he were incompetent. He bore it all with patience that Margaret found both admirable and infuriating. "They'll get used to me," he would say, "once they see I'm reliable." But they never did. The culture of the 47th Urban Defense Battalion was built on a foundation of combat experience and physical prowess. Men who had fought their way through 3 years of brutal urban warfare, who carried scars and stories, who had earned their place through blood. The hierarchy was clear and ruthlessly enforced. Combat soldiers at the top, support personnel beneath them, civilians at the bottom. Daniel was support personnel. Margaret was barely even that. She heard the comments everywhere. In the mess line, where soldiers would shuffle past Daniel without acknowledgement, then loudly discuss equipment shortages as if he weren't there. In the sleeping areas, where crude jokes about desk warriors and pencil pushers echoed through the concrete chambers. In the briefing rooms, where his input was ignored even when it concerned his own area of responsibility. Lieutenant Harrison was the worst. He seemed to take personal offense at Daniel's existence, missing no opportunity to belittle him. When supplies ran low and inevitability given their position, Harrison blamed Daniel's poor management. When soldiers complained about equipment quality, Harrison suggested Daniel was too incompetent to properly inspect incoming shipments. Reynolds couldn't organize a supply closet, Harrison had announced one evening in the common area, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. But I suppose that's what happens when you hide from the war behind a desk. The gathered soldiers had laughed. Daniel had been present, standing near the entrance with a clipboard, his face burning red. Margaret had watched from the shadows, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. The indirect attacks on her were more subtle, but no less cutting. When she tried to help in the medical station, the nurse had politely but firmly suggested she wasn't needed. When she offered to assist with meal preparation, the cooks found reasons to refuse. When she asked if there were any tasks she could perform to contribute, she was met with uncomfortable silences or vague promises to let her know if something comes up. Nothing ever came up. She existed in a strange limbo, too present to ignore, too unimportant to acknowledge. The other civilian spouses, 3 women who worked as medical assistants, maintained a careful distance from her. They had found ways to make themselves useful, to earn a place in the battalion structure. Margaret had not, and that failure marked her as surely as Daniel's physical limitations marked him. The wife of the useless one, she had heard Stevens call her once. The name had stuck, whispered behind hands, traded in quiet moments. Margaret learned to move through the station like a ghost. She mastered the art of being present but unseen, of occupying space without drawing attention. She watched and listened, absorbing the social dynamics, understanding the invisible lines that governed behavior. She saw how the soldiers interacted with each other, the rough camaraderie, the shared experiences that created bonds she could never penetrate. She observed the pecking order, the way respect flowed toward those with combat credentials and away from those without. She noted who held real power, who made decisions, who could make life easier or harder with a word. And she remembered every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty, every moment of humiliation. She catalogued them all with perfect clarity, not out of desire for revenge, but because it was her nature to observe, to analyze, to understand the terrain in which she operated. Daniel tried to shield her from the worst of it. He would deflect conversations that turned cruel, volunteer for unpleasant tasks, to avoid putting others in positions where they might express their contempt directly. He maintained a professional demeanor even when treated with open disrespect, never raising his voice, never responding in kind. Dignity, he told her once late at night in their tiny corner of the storage level. It's the only thing they can't take from us. Margaret had wanted to tell him he was wrong. Dignity was easy to take. They took it every day with their looks and their laughter and their casual dismissals. But she said nothing, holding him instead, as the wind howled through the broken skylight above. The winter deepened. The cold became absolute, a presence that dominated every moment. Soldiers returned from patrols with frostbite, their fingers and toes blackened, their faces etched with the knowledge that this city was killing them as surely as enemy bullets. Through it all, Daniel maintained the supply system with meticulous care. Ammunition counts were always accurate. Rations were distributed fairly. Equipment was tracked and maintained. He did his job with precision and dedication, never complaining, never cutting corners. It didn't matter. In the eyes of the battalion, he remained what he had been from the first day, a clerk playing soldier, a weak link in a chain that needed to be strong, a reminder that sometimes the war swept up people who had no business being in it. And Margaret remained his shadow, silent, watching, waiting. The rifle in their footlocker stayed wrapped and hidden. Not yet. The morning of Daniel's death began like any other. Margaret woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find him already dressing, moving quietly to avoid disturbing her. The temperature had dropped further during the night. She could see ice crystals forming on the inside of their tarp shelter. Her breath came in clouds that hung motionless in the still air. "Where?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "North Sector. Supply run." Daniel was pulling on extra layers, wrapping a scarf around his neck. "Harrison's patrol found a cache yesterday. We're bringing it back." Margaret sat up, fully awake now. "That's combat zone. It's a quick run, in and out before dawn."
"Daniel?"
"I have to." He turned to look at her, his eyes tired, behind the fogged lenses of his glasses. "Harrison specifically requested me. He wants someone who knows inventory to assess what's there." The unspoken truth hung between them. Harrison didn't care about Daniel's inventory skills. This was another test, another opportunity to expose weakness, a supply clerk being sent into dangerous territory to prove he couldn't handle it. Margaret rose and helped him pack his gear: canteen, rations, first aid kit. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced, calculating risks, considering options. The North Sector had been contested for weeks. Enemy forces held several buildings, creating a maze of snipers and ambush points. It was exactly the kind of environment where logistics personnel died. "Let me come with you," she said suddenly. Daniel's hands stilled. "You know that's impossible." "I could help carry." "Margaret." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're not assigned to this mission. Harrison would never allow it." "Then tell him you're sick. Don't go." "And give him exactly what he wants? Proof that I'm unreliable?" Daniel shook his head. "I have to do this. I have to show them I can." The futility of argument settled over her like the cold. He had made up his mind, driven by the same stubborn pride that had kept him standing through months of humiliation. He would go into danger to prove something to people who had already decided he was worthless. She helped him finish preparing in silence. When he was ready, she walked with him to the staging area where the patrol was gathering. 6 soldiers plus Daniel, all checking weapons and gear in the dim light of battery-powered lamps. Harrison saw them approach and smirked. "Brought your keeper, Reynolds?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Reporting as ordered, sir." "Good! You'll be carrying the extra equipment bag, 30 pounds of straps and hauling gear. Think you can manage?" "Yes, sir. We'll see." Harrison turned to his squad. "Listen up, fast and quiet. We go in, assess the cache, and tag it for transport. Reynolds determines what's worth taking. We don't linger, and we don't engage unless we have to. Clear?" A chorus of affirmatives. Margaret stood back, watching Daniel hoist the equipment bag onto his shoulders. He staggered slightly under the weight. 30 pounds was a significant load for his frame, especially on top of his normal gear. Stephen, standing nearby, laughed. "This should be entertaining." The patrol moved toward the exit stairs. Daniel glanced back once, catching Margaret's eye. She saw fear there, carefully concealed but unmistakable. He was terrified, but he would do it anyway because refusing would be worse than dying. Margaret nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Then they were gone, disappearing up the stairs into the frozen morning. She tried to occupy herself with routine tasks, but her mind remained fixed on the North Sector. She found herself in the communications room, listening to radio chatter, tracking patrol movements through the fragmented reports that came in. The operator, a young corporal named Hayes, tolerated her presence without comment. The patrol checked in at regular intervals. First report, reached the cache location. Second report, assessing contents. Third report, preparing to mark items for recovery. Then nothing. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as the silence stretched. Hayes tried the radio repeatedly, his voice taking on an edge of concern. Night 7, this is base. Report status. Static. Night 7, respond. More static, punctuated by the distant crack of gunfire coming through the transmission before it cut off entirely. Hayes grabbed another radio, switching frequencies. All units, this is base. We've lost contact with Night 7, North Sector. Can anyone eyes on? Responses came back quickly, negative from all stations. The North Sector was too contested, too dangerous for anyone to risk a rescue attempt for a 7-man patrol. Margaret stood frozen, her fingernails digging into her palms. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Hayes continued trying to raise the patrol while coordinating with other units, trying to piece together what had happened from fragmentary reports and distant observations. Finally, nearly an hour after the last contact, a transmission came through. It was Harrison's voice, rough and strained. Base Night 7, we're coming back. 3 wounded, 1 KIA. Margaret's world tilted. Identify casualties, Hayes requested, his voice carefully professional. A pause, static, then, Reynolds, he's gone. The communications room continued to function around her. Hayes coordinating a medical team, other operators managing traffic, but Margaret heard none of it. She was moving, pushing through the door, descending stairs, heading toward the entrance where the patrol would return. She reached the ground level as the heavy door opened. The patrol filed in, supporting each other, their uniforms torn and blood-stained. Harrison came first, his left arm wrapped in a crude bandage. Stevens followed, his face pale with shock. The others were battered but mobile. 2 soldiers at the rear carried Daniel. His body was wrapped in a thermal blanket, only his face visible. His glasses were gone. Blood had frozen in dark streaks across his cheek. His eyes were closed. And in death, he looked younger somehow, peaceful in a way he had never been in life. Margaret approached slowly, her boots echoing on the concrete. The soldiers carrying Daniel stopped, unsure whether to acknowledge her. She knelt beside the makeshift stretcher, one hand reaching out to touch his cold face. What happened? Her voice was steady, empty of emotion. Harrison stepped forward, wincing. Ambush came out of nowhere. Enemy squad had the building across from the cache location. We were exposed, and they had elevation. How did he die? First volley. He was carrying the equipment bag, couldn't move fast enough to reach cover. Harrison's voice carried no mockery now, only exhaustion. It was quick. Margaret's hand lingered on Daniel's face, feeling the cold skin beneath her fingers. She had known this would happen. From the moment Harrison requested him for the mission, she had known. The man who mocked weakness had sent weakness into danger, and the result was inevitable. Where's his gear? She asked. We left it, had to move fast, couldn't carry everything. She looked up at Harrison. Her eyes were dry, her expression calm. His gear included personal items. I want them back. It's a combat zone. I want them back. Something in her voice made Harrison pause. For the first time, he looked at her as if actually seeing her. We'll try to recover what we can when we secure the area, but I can't promise anything. Margaret stood, stepping back from the stretcher. The soldiers carried Daniel away, taking him to the makeshift morgue in one of the lower storage rooms. She watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned and walked back toward her sleeping area with measured steps. Behind her, she heard voices. Poor woman. At least it was fast. Better than slowly freezing to death out there. Think she'll evacuate now? The words washed over her without impact. She felt nothing. No grief, no rage, no despair. There was only a cold clarity that settled into her bones like the winter itself. In their corner of the storage level, she opened the footlocker, pushed aside clothing and personal items until her hands found the wrapped bundle at the bottom. The oilcloth was cold to the touch, stiff from the temperature. She unwrapped it slowly, methodically, revealing the rifle piece by piece. A Remington 700 civilian model converted for long-range precision work, purchased legally before the war when she had been a competitive marksman and the world had made sense. She had carried it with her through the evacuation, through the chaos of relocation, through 8 months in this frozen hell, waiting. Margaret assembled the rifle with practiced efficiency. Her hands remembered every movement from hundreds of hours at the range, from competitions she had won and forgotten. The weapon came together smoothly, stock, action, barrel, scope. She checked the mechanism, tested the trigger pull, verified everything functioned despite months of storage. From a hidden compartment in the footlocker's lining, she retrieved ammunition. Match-grade rounds, carefully hoarded, 20 cartridges that would have to be enough. She loaded 5 rounds into the internal magazine, worked the bolt to chamber 1. The mechanical precision of it calmed something deep inside her. Not grief, not yet. First, there was work to do. Margaret had learned to shoot from her father, a police marksman who believed his daughter should know how to protect herself. That was 15 years ago, in a different world, when guns were tools for sport and the idea of urban warfare seemed like something from history books. She had taken to it naturally. The patience, the precision, the mathematical nature of long-range shooting, it all resonated with her methodical mind. By age 20, she was competing in regional matches. By 25, she had won the state championship 3 years running. The skills required for competitive shooting were extensive. Understanding ballistic shell, wind, humidity, temperature, and elevation affected bullet trajectory, reading environmental conditions through subtle cues, invisible to untrained observers, calculating distances, angles, and holdovers with intuitive speed, controlling breathing and heartbeat to maintain stability during the shot. Most importantly, there was the mental discipline. Competitive shooting was as much psychological as physical. The ability to maintain focus for hours, to block out distractions, to execute the fundamentals perfectly under pressure, these were the skills that separated good shooters from great ones. Margaret had been great. Then she met Daniel, a graduate student researching medieval history at the university where she worked in admissions. He was gentle and thoughtful, fascinated by obscure manuscripts and forgotten scholars. He knew nothing about firearms and had no interest in learning. Their worlds were completely different, but somehow they fit together. They married in the summer of 2019. She stopped competing shortly after, the demands of building a life together taking precedence over weekends at the range. The rifle went into storage. The skills remained dormant but intact. When the war started 2 years later, it felt distant. News reports from foreign countries, diplomatic protests, economic sanctions, terrible but abstract. Then the fighting spread, borders collapsed, and suddenly the war was everywhere. Their city became a strategic objective. Evacuation orders came too late. They found themselves swept up in a chaos of violence and displacement that left no room for civilian sovereign concerns. The military was desperate for personnel. Everyone with skills was pressed into service. Margaret's shooting background should have made her valuable, but that information never made it into any official record. The evacuation had been too chaotic, the documentation too haphazard. She arrived at the 47th Battalion as nothing more than Daniel's wife, a civilian dependent with no listed qualifications. She could have corrected the oversight, could have approached Harrison or another officer, demonstrated her abilities, requested an assignment. But she had watched the way the battalion treated Daniel, seen the contempt for those deemed weak or different. She understood that revealing her skills would mean being tested, judged, potentially rejected, or worse, accepted but then resented. So she said nothing. She wrapped the rifle in oilcloth and buried it at the bottom of their footlocker, along with the ammunition she had carried through the evacuation. She became invisible, unremarkable, a woman who existed only in relation to her husband. But she never stopped observing. The frozen city was a sniper's paradise and nightmare simultaneously. The urban terrain provided countless positions, high buildings, broken walls, rubble piles that offered both concealment and firing lanes. The snow muffled sound and movement, making it difficult to locate shooters. The cold air was dense and stable, providing excellent conditions for long-range accuracy. But that same environment was brutal. Metal froze, oil thickened, exposed skin stuck to gunmetal, scope lenses fogged. The cold sapped strength and dulled reflexes. A sniper could freeze to death in a position before ever taking a shot. Margaret studied the dynamics of urban winter combat through careful observation. She watched how patrols moved, where they took cover, which routes they preferred. She noted enemy patterns from the snippets of information that filtered back through debriefings and radio chatter. She memorized the layout of surrounding blocks, identifying key buildings and sightlines. She understood wind patterns unique to the urban environment. Cold air funneled through streets like rivers, creating complex currents between buildings. The snow changed everything: depth, texture, and coverage, all affected how sound carried and where movement was visible. Reflections off ice and snow could betray a position or create false signatures that drew attention to empty spaces. Most importantly, she understood patience. Real sniping wasn't the Hollywood version of dramatic shots and instant kills. It was hours of cold, motionless observation. It was waiting for the perfect moment that might never come. It was the discipline to not take a shot unless every factor aligned. All of this knowledge remained locked inside her head, useless, as the war ground on and Daniel suffered daily humiliations. Until now. Now, sitting in the dim light of their storage corner, with the rifle assembled on her lap, Margaret felt the old skills awakening. Her hands remembered the weight and balance of the weapon. Her eye found the scope naturally, checking alignment and clarity. Her mind began calculating ranges and trajectories, running through scenarios with mechanical precision. She thought about the North Sector, about the ambush that had killed Daniel. Harrison had said the enemy squad held a building with elevation, a position that allowed them to pin down the patrol. That building was still there. Those enemies were still there, celebrating their successful engagement, believing they owned that piece of territory. Margaret pulled out the map Hayes had left on a table in the communications room, one she had studied so many times she could reproduce it from memory. She located the cache site, traced the likely routes of approach and retreat. Based on Harrison's description, the enemy position would be in one of 3 buildings. She studied each potential location, considering factors most soldiers never thought about. Height, window positions, angles of fire, escape routes. She eliminated 2 buildings as tactically inferior, which left one a 6-story apartment block with intact upper floors and excellent sightlines covering the entire intersection. If she were establishing an ambush position, that's where she would be. The question was whether the enemy squad would still be there. They might have withdrawn after the engagement, relocated to avoid retaliation. But this was contested territory, valuable for its commanding view. If they abandoned it, someone else would take it. Margaret made her decision with the same cold clarity that had descended upon her since Daniel's death. She would wait until the battalion attempted to recover his gear and secure the cache. When the next patrol went north, she would go with them, not officially, not with permission, but simply by being present and armed in a way that looked official. And once she was in position, once she could see that building, she would do what she did best. She would shoot. The enemy's offensive began 36 hours after Daniel's death. It started with artillery distant thunder that rolled across the frozen city, shaking snow from damaged buildings. Then came the small arms fire, a sustained crackle that suggested a major push rather than the usual skirmishes. Radio traffic exploded with reports from observation posts and forward positions. Margaret listened from the communications room where Hayes had stopped questioning her presence. She tracked the developing situation through fragmentary transmissions and hurried conversations between officers. The pattern was clear. Enemy forces were advancing through the western districts, pushing toward the transit station from multiple directions. The goal seemed to be encirclement cut off the 47th Battalion from supply lines and reinforcement, then either force surrender or reduce the position through attrition. "They're hitting 4 sectors simultaneously," Hayes said, updating markers on the situation map. "Coordinated attack. This isn't a probe, this is the real thing." Margaret studied the map. Red markers indicating enemy positions were multiplying, forming a tightening noose around the station's defensive perimeter. Blue markers showing friendly forces looked pitifully scattered in comparison. Captain Reeves, the battalion commander, entered the room with Harrison and 2 other officers. They gathered around the map, faces grim. "What's our strength?" Reeves asked. 132 effectives, Harrison reported. Another 20 wounded but capable of fighting from defensive positions. "We're at 60% of rated ammunition levels. Food for 6 days on current rations." "Reinforcements?" "Command says they're sending the 23rd, but they're still 48 hours out. We're on our own until then." Reeves studied the map in silence. He was an older man, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had seen too much. "Recommendations? Pull back to inner perimeter," Harrison suggested. "Abandon the outer defensive positions. Consolidate around the station proper. We can hold that for 48 hours. "And cede 8 blocks to the enemy," another officer objected. "That puts them in positions to shell us directly. Better than spreading ourselves too thin and getting overrun piecemeal." The argument continued, officers debating tactics while the situation deteriorated. Margaret remained in the background, invisible as always, but her mind was working. The enemy advance was creating gaps areas where their forces were stretched thin as they pushed forward. The north sector, where Daniel had died, would be particularly vulnerable. If the enemy was committing troops to the main assault, they would strip personnel from static positions. That building, the one she had identified as the likely sniper nest, might be abandoned or only lightly held. It was an opportunity, but also a massive risk. The entire city was becoming a battlefield. Moving through it, even for experienced soldiers, would be suicidal. For a woman with no official assignment carrying an unsanctioned rifle, it would be madness. Margaret didn't care. The decision had been made the moment Daniel's body came through the door. Everything since then had just been preparation. She left the communications room as the officers continued their debate. In the lower levels, soldiers were fortifying positions, stacking sandbags, preparing firing positions. The mood was tense but determined. These were veterans who had survived worse. Margaret returned to her corner and methodically prepared her gear. She selected clothing for layered warmth and mobility, no bulky coats that would restrict movement. She packed a small rucksack with ammunition, water, and minimal rations. She checked the rifle again, ensuring every component functioned perfectly. From beneath her cot, she retrieved something she had been saving, a set of military fatigues taken from Lost and Found weeks ago. They were too large, but with adjustments they would pass casual inspection. She added a knit cap to cover her hair, and a scarf that could be wrapped to conceal her face. In the dim light, properly equipped, she could pass for just another soldier. Not close inspection, but from a distance in chaos it would work. The bombardment intensified as evening fell. The station shook with each impact, dust and ice crystals raining from the ceiling. Soldiers moved with practiced urgency, carrying ammunition to fighting positions, evacuating wounded to the medical station. Margaret joined the flow of personnel, rifle slung over her shoulder, blending into the organized chaos. No one looked twice. No one questioned. She was just another body in uniform, heading to assigned positions. She made her way to the north exit, a secondary entrance used primarily for patrols and small teams. 2 soldiers guarded it, but they were focused on the situation outside, monitoring radio chatter, preparing to secure the door if friendly units needed to retreat inside. Margaret waited in the shadows as a patrol returned, 3 soldiers bloodied and exhausted. The guards opened the door, helped them inside, then secured it again. But in that moment of distraction, Margaret slipped past, moving through the door before it closed, emerging into the frozen streets above. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped further, well below zero, the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. Snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. Margaret oriented herself quickly using landmarks she had memorized from the map. The north sector was 12 blocks away through contested territory. Moving directly would be suicide. She needed to use a circuitous route, staying in cover, avoiding both friendly and enemy forces. She began to move, keeping to shadows and rubble, using the techniques she had learned from observation and instinct. The city at night was a maze of dangerous, collapsed buildings that could shift without warning, hidden ice patches, areas where the ground had been undermined by shelling, and everywhere the presence of death. She passed bodies frozen in the snow, both military and civilian, some recent, others preserved by the cold for weeks. She saw defensive positions hastily abandoned, equipment scattered in the chaos of retreat. The city was dying, block by block, building by building. But Margaret moved through it with purpose, her mind focused on a single objective. That building, that squad, the ones who had killed Daniel. Justice or revenge, she didn't bother distinguishing between them. It was simply something that needed to be done, as inevitable as the snow falling around her. She reached a partially collapsed office building 3 blocks from her destination and paused to assess the situation. From this position, she could see the target, the 6-story apartment block that dominated the intersection. Lights flickered in the upper windows. Figures moved across openings. The position was still occupied. Margaret checked her rifle one final time, then began climbing the office building's damaged stairwell, heading for the roof. The hunt had begun. Margaret had been gone for 6 hours before anyone noticed. Hayes discovered her absence when he went to the storage level looking for inventory records that Daniel would have maintained. Instead, he found an empty corner, the footlocker open, and picked through obvious gaps where equipment should have been. He immediately reported to Harrison, who had just returned from coordinating the western defensive positions. The lieutenant's face darkened as Hayes described what he'd found. Missing cold weather gear, an empty space where something long and heavy had been stored. She wouldn't, Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Her husband's body is in the morgue, Hayes pointed out. Maybe she went to... No, she's gone out. Harrison grabbed his radio. All units, this is Harrison. We have a civilian female missing, possibly outside the perimeter. She's armed with what we believe is a civilian rifle. Eyes on, do not engage, report immediately. The responses came back quickly. No sightings. In the chaos of the ongoing battle, a lone figure could easily slip through gaps in the defensive lines. Captain Reeves was informed. He listened to Harrison's report with weary resignation. We can't spare personnel for a search. She made her choice. Sir, if she's captured, then she's captured. We have 130 soldiers fighting for their lives right now. I won't risk any of them to chase after a civilian who decided to commit suicide by enemy fire. Reeves turned back to the situation map. Log it, move on. Harrison wanted to argue, but he understood the calculus. Resources were finite. Every soldier mattered. A civilian widow, even one whose husband had served with the battalion, was expendable. Word spread quickly through the station. The wife of the useless one had finally cracked, gone mad with grief, walked out into the frozen city to die. Some expressed sympathy. Most just shrugged. One more casualty in a war that had already taken thousands. Stevens, overhearing the conversation in the common area, laughed bitterly. Guess she couldn't handle it without her clerk to take care of her. No one disagreed. 3 miles north, Margaret was very much handling it. She had reached her chosen position, the roof of the office building, just before dawn. The climb had been brutal, 4 flights of damaged stairs that required careful navigation in the dark. Twice she had nearly fallen through gaps in the structure. Her hands were numb despite gloves, her face stinging from windburn. But she had made it. The roof provided an elevated position with clear sight lines to the target building. Margaret had scouted 3 potential firing positions, selecting the one that offered the best combination of cover, concealment, and shooting angle. She cleared away snow, arranged rubble to create a natural-looking hide, and settled in to wait. The cold was devastating. Even with layers, even with the techniques she knew for managing hypothermia, she could feel it sapping her strength. Her fingers and toes were dangerously numb. Her face felt frozen beneath the scarf. But she had trained for this. During her competitive years, she had participated in winter matches where shooters spent hours in sub-zero conditions. She knew how to stay functional in cold that would incapacitate untrained people. Constant, subtle movement to maintain circulation, breathing techniques to warm the core, mental discipline to ignore the discomfort. As dawn broke, gray and dim through the falling snow, Margaret began her observation. The target building was definitely occupied. She counted at least 6 individuals moving between windows on the 4th and 5th floors. They were using the position exactly as she had predicted, as an observation post and firing position, covering the intersection where the supply cache was located. Through her scope, Margaret could make out details. The enemy soldiers wore mismatched winter gear, a mix of military and civilian cold-weather clothing. They moved with casual confidence, clearly feeling secure in their position. They had established a fighting position with sandbags at 2 windows, a heavy machine gun in one, a marksman with a scoped rifle in the other. That marksman had probably been the one who killed Daniel. Margaret watched him for a long time, noting his patterns. He would scan through his scope for several minutes, then pull back to rest his eyes, then return. He was disciplined, experienced, not someone who would make easy mistakes. The machine gunner was more relaxed, occasionally stepping back from his position to smoke or talk with others out of view. The machine gun itself was a concern. It could lay down suppressive fire across a wide area, making any approach from below suicidal. Margaret considered her options. A hasty shot at maximum range through falling snow would likely miss, alerting the enemy to her presence without achieving results. She needed to wait for better conditions, for the precise moment when multiple factors aligned. Competitive shooting had taught her that patience was as important as skill. You could be the best marksman in the world, but if you took the shot at the wrong moment, you would miss. Success came from waiting, watching, recognizing opportunity when it appeared. Hours passed. The cold deepened. Margaret's extremities progressed from numb to painful to numb again, a dangerous sign. She forced herself to eat small amounts of rations, to drink water from her canteen before it froze solid. She shifted position incrementally, maintaining circulation without breaking concealment. The enemy soldiers below maintained their routine. Shift changes occurred every few hours. New faces appeared at the windows, others retreated deeper into the building. Margaret counted at least 9 individuals total, meaning a full squad was garrisoned in that position. 9 targets, 20 rounds. The mathematics were stark. She would need to be perfect. As afternoon wore into evening, the snow finally began to ease. The wind shifted, coming from a more consistent direction. Visibility improved to nearly 200 yards. The conditions were approaching acceptable. Margaret checked her rifle again, cleared the action, ensuring no ice had formed. Verified the scope was clear. Calculated the range approximately 170 yards, slightly downward angle. She ran the ballistics in her head, adjusting for cold air density, windage, the slight declination. The marksman appeared at the window again, settling into position behind his rifle. Margaret watched him through her scope, her breath shallow and controlled. He was searching for targets, scanning the intersection and approaches, looking for more victims like Daniel. Margaret's finger found the trigger. Not yet. Wait for the moment. The marksman adjusted his position, getting comfortable. He settled behind the scope, his posture indicating he was focused on something in the distance. Now, Margaret's world narrowed to the reticle, the target, the trigger. Her breathing stopped, her heart rate slowed, the cold vanished. There was only the shot. She pressed the trigger. The rifle's report was shockingly loud in the frozen silence, the sound echoing off buildings. Through the scope, Margaret saw the impact the marksman's head, snapping back, his body crumpling out of sight. The reaction was immediate, voices shouting in the building, movement as soldiers rushed to the fallen man's position. The machine gunner swung his weapon around, trying to locate the source of fire. Margaret had already worked the bolt, chambering the next round. She tracked the machine gunner as he searched for her. He was exposed, standing fully in the window, backlit by interior lights. Second shot. The machine gunner dropped. Chaos in the building now, soldiers running, trying to figure out what was happening. They knew the shots came from elevation, but couldn't pinpoint the exact location. 3 more appeared at the windows, trying to get visual. Margaret took her time with the third shot, waiting for one of them to pause long enough. A soldier leaned out, pointing in the general direction of her building. She centered the reticle on his chest and fired. He fell back into the building. The remaining soldiers finally understood the danger. They pulled back from windows, taking cover deeper inside. Margaret had seconds before they organized a response. She searched for targets, finding a face peering around a window frame. Fourth shot. Missed the soldier, jerked back just as she fired. Fifth shot. Center mass as he tried to move to a new position. Down. Her magazine was empty. Margaret worked the bolt, reloaded smoothly. 5 fresh rounds. The building had gone quiet. No one visible at any window. They were regrouping, probably preparing to either flee or mount a counterattack. She needed to maintain pressure, keep them disorganized. Margaret shifted her aim to the lower floors, watching for movement. There a shadow crossing a room on the 3rd floor. She fired through the window, not knowing if she had hit. Then another target, 2nd floor, shot. The figure dropped. 6 down, possibly 7. 3 left from her original count, maybe more if reinforcements had arrived. Margaret's hands were shaking now, not from cold or fear, but from the adrenaline dump of sustained action. She forced herself to breathe, to maintain control. She reloaded again, her supply of ammunition shrinking. 12 rounds left. A window on the ground floor shattered outward. Soldiers were evacuating, trying to escape the killing ground their position had become. Margaret tracked the movement, seeing 2 figures running across the snowy street toward adjacent cover. She led the first runner by a fraction, accounting for movement and distance. Shot. He tumbled forward into the snow. The second runner made it to cover. She waited, rifle trained on the position. People in panic made mistakes. They rushed, they peeked, they assumed safety where none existed. True to form, the soldier leaned out after 30 seconds, trying to see if his position was compromised. Margaret's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him backward. 8 down, 1 remaining, maybe hiding in the building, maybe having fled. Margaret waited. Minutes stretched. Her body was screaming at her now, the cold finally overwhelming her defenses. She knew she was approaching the limit of survivability. Soon she would have to withdraw or freeze to death in this position. A figure emerged from the building's rear entrance, running hard toward the north. Margaret tracked him, led by several body lengths, and fired. The soldier pitched forward and didn't rise. 9 down. The building was silent now, windows dark and empty. An entire squad eliminated in less than 15 minutes. Margaret worked the bolt one more time, scanning for any additional movement. Nothing. The mission was complete. Margaret remained in position for another hour, watching, ensuring there were no survivors organizing a response. Her body had progressed beyond cold into a dangerous numbness. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She knew the signs of hypothermia, confused thinking, loss of coordination, eventual unconsciousness. She needed to move soon, or she would die here. But not yet, not until she was certain. The city around her had grown quieter as darkness fell. The intensity of fighting had decreased, both sides exhausted and depleted. In the distance, she could still hear sporadic gunfire and the occasional crump of mortar rounds, but the immediate area had settled into an uneasy silence. Margaret finally allowed herself to accept that no one else was coming. The enemy squad was gone, wiped from existence in a matter of minutes. Daniel's death had been answered with overwhelming surgical violence. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel anything. The cold had numbed her emotions as thoroughly as it had numbed her extremities. Margaret carefully packed her rifle, moving with the slow precision of someone whose fine motor control was failing. She gathered her spent brass 9 cartridges that represented 9 lives ended. She left no evidence of her presence except the brass, and that was intentional. Let them find it. Let them know. The descent from the building was harder than the climb. Her legs barely functioned, forcing her to half fall downstairs, catching herself on walls and railings. Several times she nearly collapsed, her body simply refusing to continue. But she kept moving, one step, then another, drawing on reserves of will she hadn't known existed. Daniel would have been proud of her stubbornness, she thought distantly. He had always admired her determination. The journey back to the transit station took 4 hours. It should have taken less than 1, but Margaret was operating at the edge of physical capability. She took frequent breaks, forcing herself to move before the cold could fully immobilize her. She navigated by instinct and memory, the city a blur of shadows and snow. She didn't remember the final approach, didn't remember being challenged by sentries or somehow providing a response that allowed her through. Her next clear memory was of Hayes finding her collapsed just inside the north entrance, rifle still clutched in frozen hands. "Jesus Christ," she heard him say, then shouting for medical assistance. She tried to speak, to explain, but her jaw wouldn't work. The cold had locked her muscles solid. Hands lifted her, carried her somewhere warm. Light and sound became confused, overlapping, then darkness and blessed warmth. Margaret woke in the medical station, buried under thermal blankets, an IV line running into her arm. A medic sat nearby, an older woman named Chen, who monitored vital signs with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky," Chen said, when she saw Margaret's eyes open. "Another hour and you'd be dead from exposure." Margaret tried to speak, her throat raw. "How long?" 8 hours. "We've been treating you for severe hypothermia and frostbite. You'll probably lose a couple toes and some fingertips." Chen's expression was clinical, professional. "Want to tell me what the hell you were doing out there?" Before Margaret could answer, the curtain separating her cot from the rest of the medical station pulled back. Captain Reeves stood there with Harrison beside him. Both looked exhausted and grim. "Leave us," Reeves said to Chen. The medic hesitated, then nodded and departed. Reeves pulled up a stool and sat beside Margaret's cot. Harrison remained standing, arms crossed. "You went into the north sector," Reeves said. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded slightly. "Armed with an unauthorized weapon." Another nod. "Do you know what the penalty is for a civilian taking up arms without authorization?" "No, sir." Reeves studied her for a long moment. "That depends on what you did with those arms. So tell me, what exactly happened out there?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, her vocal cords still recovering. "I eliminated the enemy squad, occupying the observation position at grid reference, November 7. Harrison's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "You what?" "The marksman position that ambushed your patrol. I killed them." "That's impossible," Harrison said flatly. "That position had 9 occupants," Margaret interrupted. 1 marksman with a scoped rifle, 1 machine gunner, 7 others in support roles. I engaged them from an elevated position approximately 170 yards distant. The 2 officers exchanged glances. "She's delirious," Harrison said. "Hypothermia causes hallucinations." "My rifle is at the north entrance with Hayes," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "Check the action. 9 rounds fired. I left the brass on site." Reeves leaned forward. "Why would you do this?" "They killed my husband. That's war. People die." "Yes, sir, and now they've died too." The captain was silent for a moment. Then he stood. Harrison, send a patrol to verify her claims. If that position is actually abandoned, I want confirmation and details. Sir, we can't spare. Do it. If she's telling the truth, I need to know what we're dealing with. Reeves looked back at Margaret. Don't go anywhere. We'll continue this conversation when my lieutenant returns. They left. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. Around her, the medical station continued its work-wounded soldiers being treated, supplies being organized. The ordinary chaos of war. She had just begun to drift when she heard voices near the entrance. Impossible. No way she could have. I'm telling you what I saw, Lieutenant. Harrison had returned faster than expected. Margaret forced her eyes open as he pushed back through the curtain, his face pale. She did it, he said to the empty space where Reeves had been. Then realizing Margaret was awake, how? I'm a marksman, Margaret replied simply. I have been for 15 years. Why didn't you tell anyone? No one asked. Harrison stared at her, clearly struggling with some internal calculus. The patrol found 9 bodies, all of them killed by precision rifle fire. The position is completely abandoned. He paused. That squad had been causing casualties for 2 weeks. They were dug in, well protected. We were planning a major operation to dislodge them. You don't need to now. No, we don't. Harrison looked away. I need to report this to the captain. He left again. Margaret lay back, staring at the concrete ceiling. Her body ached, her extremities burned with the returning sensation of warming tissue. But beneath the physical discomfort was something else, a hollow emptiness, where emotion should have been. Daniel was still dead. Revenge hadn't brought him back, hadn't made anything better. She had simply removed 9 people from the world, 9 men who probably had families and lives and reasons for fighting just like Daniel had. But she felt no regret, only a cold certainty that it had been necessary, that some debts could only be paid in blood. Captain Reeves returned an hour later, this time alone. He sat again, studying Margaret with new eyes. You've created a problem for me, he said finally. A civilian with unauthorized weapons who conducted an independent combat operation. That's multiple violations of military law. Yes, sir. On the other hand, you've eliminated a significant enemy strongpoint and done it with 0 friendly casualties. That's a tactical victory we desperately needed. Margaret said nothing. Here's what's going to happen, Reeves continued. You're going to be formally inducted into this battalion as a scout sniper specialist with immediate effect. Your actions will be classified as a sanctioned reconnaissance mission. The rifle you used will be officially logged as issued equipment. Are we clear? Why would you do that? Because we're outnumbered, outgunned, and barely holding on, Reeves said bluntly. Because that skill you've been hiding might be the difference between our survival and annihilation. Because I can't afford to court-martial the best shooter in this battalion for technicalities. He leaned forward. Can you do it again? Kill people? Eliminate enemy positions, save soldiers' lives. Help us hold this sector until reinforcements arrive. Margaret thought about Daniel, about the months of humiliation he had endured, about how the battalion had used him and discarded him as worthless. Yes, she said, I can do it again. Then welcome to active service. Reeves stood. When Chen clears you medically, report to Harrison. He'll coordinate targeting and positioning. We'll keep you supplied and supported. After he left, Margaret lay alone with the enormity of what had just happened. In the span of a day, she had gone from invisible to essential, from the wife of the useless one to someone the battalion needed. All it had cost was everything she had been before, and 9 lives taken in cold blood on a frozen rooftop. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Captain Reeves officially inducted Margaret into the battalion's roster. She was issued proper military identification, assigned to a scout sniper team of 1, and given priority for whatever equipment she needed. The transformation in how others treated her was immediate and disorienting. Soldiers who had ignored her for months now nodded respectfully when she passed. Stevens, who had mocked Daniel so casually, offered to carry her gear. Hayes gave her unrestricted access to the communications room and situation maps. Even Harrison, though still wary, treated her as a legitimate asset rather than a burden. Chen released her from medical care with warnings about monitoring her frostbite injuries. Margaret had indeed lost portions of 3 toes and the tip of 1 finger, but she could still function. The medic had wrapped the wounds carefully and provided antibiotics to prevent infection. "You're tougher than you look," Chen said as Margaret left. It might have been the first compliment anyone in the battalion had ever given her. The reality of Margaret's new role became clear during her first briefing with Harrison. They stood over a map in the battalion command post, surrounded by officers coordinating the ongoing defense. "We have 13 confirmed enemy strongpoints within our perimeter," Harrison explained, marking positions with red pins. "Each one represents a squad or larger force that can bring fire on our movements. Your action in the North Sector proved that precision elimination is effective." "You want me to hit all of them?" Margaret asked. "Not all at once. We'll prioritize based on threat level and opportunity. Today's target is here." He tapped a position 3 blocks west. "A sniper team that's been interdicting our supply runs. 2 individuals probably working from this building's upper floors." Margaret studied the map, calculating distances and sight lines. "I'll need aerial reconnaissance photos if available. Otherwise, I'll have to spend time observing to identify exact positions." "We don't have photos. You'll have to do it the hard way." "Then I'll need at least 12 hours of observation time." Harrison nodded. "We can arrange that. There's a building here that should provide adequate line of sight. I'll have a team escort you into position." "No escorts," Margaret said firmly. "I work alone." "That's not." "Alone, Lieutenant. I can move more quietly and attract less attention. Additional personnel just creates complications." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, but Captain Reeves, listening from nearby, intervened. "Let her do it her way. She's earned that much." So Margaret went alone, slipping out through the north entrance in the pre-dawn darkness. She carried her rifle, ammunition, and minimal gear. The cold was still brutal, but she knew her limits now, understood how to manage the environment without succumbing to it. She found the observation building without incident and settled in for the long wait. Through her scope, she eventually identified the enemy sniper team. 2 men working from a partially collapsed apartment building, taking turns on the rifle while the others spotted. They were skilled, patient, professional. Margaret watched them for hours, learning their patterns, their rhythms, the tiny details that would make the difference. She noted when they changed positions, how long they maintained focus, where they were most exposed. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she took the shots. 2 quick rounds, 1 second apart. Both targets down before either realized they were in danger. She returned to the station and filed a brief report. The mission had taken 14 hours but resulted in complete success. Another enemy position eliminated, another threat removed from the battalion's operational environment. Word spread quickly. The invisible woman, the one they had mocked and dismissed, was systematically destroying enemy positions with surgical precision. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her existence now watched with something approaching awe as she prepared for missions. But the attention made her uncomfortable. Margaret had never sought recognition or respect from these people. She had wanted only for Daniel to be treated with dignity, for them both to survive the war with some measure of humanity intact. Now Daniel was dead, and the respect she had never received was flowing toward her in abundance. It felt hollow, tainted. On the 3rd day, Stevens approached her in the common area. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. He carried 2 ration cups, offering one to her. "I wanted to apologize," he said awkwardly, "for how I treated your husband, for what I said about you. It was wrong." Margaret took the cup, but didn't drink from it. Why apologize now? "Because I was an asshole. Because I judged him for not being a combat soldier when I should have respected that he did his job well." Stevens looked away. "Because I never thought about who you were until you proved yourself, and that's not how it should work." "You're right," Margaret said quietly. "It shouldn't take killing 9 people to earn basic human decency." Stevens flinched at that. He started to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded once and walked away, leaving his apology hanging incomplete in the air between them. Similar encounters happened throughout the day. Soldiers wanting to express regret, to acknowledge their mistreatment of Daniel, to somehow repair damage that could never be undone. Margaret accepted their words with polite neutrality, giving them nothing, not forgiveness, not absolution, not even anger. Daniel was dead. Their regret was useless. That evening, Captain Reeves called her to his office, a converted storage room that served as battalion headquarters. He sat behind a desk made from stacked crates, paperwork organized in neat piles around him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a folding chair. Margaret sat, still carrying her rifle. She hadn't let it leave her possession since returning from the first mission. "You've been extremely effective," Reeves began. 4 enemy positions eliminated in 3 days with 0 friendly casualties. That's unprecedented success for a sniper operating in urban winter conditions. "Thank you, sir. But I'm concerned about your mental state. Chen tells me you're not sleeping, you're barely eating. You spend every free moment preparing equipment or studying maps." He leaned forward. "Margaret, what you're doing isn't sustainable. You're burning yourself out." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're a woman who lost her husband 3 days ago and immediately threw herself into the most dangerous possible job. That's not healthy grieving, that's trauma response." Margaret's hands tightened on her rifle. "With respect, sir, my mental health is not relevant to my operational effectiveness. It becomes relevant when I need to depend on you for the next 6 weeks until reinforcements arrive. If you collapse from exhaustion or make mistakes due to psychological strain, soldiers die." Reeves softened his tone. "I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to keep you alive and functional. Then give me more targets." "That's exactly what I'm talking about. This vendetta—" "It's not a vendetta," Margaret interrupted. "It's war. You said it yourself. People die, and I'm making sure fewer of our people die by killing their people first. Isn't that what you wanted?" Reeves was silent for a moment. "I wanted a sniper. I'm getting something else, something I'm not sure I know how to manage." "You don't need to manage me. You need to point me at enemy positions and let me work. And when the enemy is gone, when this sector is secured and the fighting moves elsewhere, what happens to you then?" Margaret had no answer to that. She hadn't thought beyond the immediate present, beyond the next mission, the next target. The future was an abstraction that held no meaning. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "That's what concerns me." Reeves shuffled papers on his desk. "You're off rotation for the next 48 hours. Rest, eat, process what you've been through, that's an order." "Sir!" "Not negotiable. You're exhausted, you're injured, and you're running on grief and adrenaline. Take the time. The enemy will still be there when you're ready." Margaret wanted to argue, but the chain of command was absolute. She nodded reluctantly and left the office. The next 2 days were torture. With no missions to prepare for, no targets to study, Margaret was left alone with thoughts she had been successfully avoiding. She tried to sleep but found only nightmares. She tried to eat but had no appetite. She sat in her corner of the storage level, the space that had been hers and Daniel's, and felt his absence like a physical wound. His few possessions were still there, neatly organized as he had left them. His spare uniform, his notebooks full of inventory logs, the book he had been reading, a history of medieval monasteries with a bookmark still holding his place. Margaret picked up the book and opened it to the marked page. Daniel's handwriting filled the margins, notes, observations, questions he had been considering. His mind had always been active, curious, seeking understanding, even in the midst of war. She read his notes, trying to hear his voice in the words, trying to remember what it felt like when he was alive, when they were together, when the world made some kind of sense. The grief finally broke through her defenses in a wave so powerful it drove her to her knees. She clutched Daniel's book and wept for the first time since his death. Great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for him, for what they had lost, for the future they would never have. She cried for herself, for the person she had been, before the cold had gotten inside her soul. When the tears finally stopped, she felt emptied, hollowed out, but also somehow more clear-headed than she had been since Daniel died. Reeves was right. She had been running on trauma, using missions as a way to avoid processing loss. The killing had been satisfying in a cold, practical way, but it hadn't actually helped. Daniel was still gone. Revenge was still empty. Margaret carefully closed the book and set it aside. She lay down on her cot and, for the first time in days, fell into genuine sleep. When she woke 12 hours later, she felt different. Not healed. Healing would take years, if it came at all, but functional in a way she hadn't been before. Ready to continue, but with clearer understanding of what she was doing and why. She returned to duty with renewed focus. Over the following weeks, she eliminated 17 more enemy positions, each mission executed with mechanical precision. But now she did it as a soldier, not as a widow seeking vengeance. The distinction was subtle but significant. The battalion held their sector. Reinforcements arrived. The enemy offensive stalled and eventually retreated. Against all odds, they had survived. And through it all, Margaret continued her silent work. A ghost in the frozen city, dealing death from distances that kept her emotionally and physically removed from the targets. It was easier that way. The war moved on, as wars do, leaving behind landscapes of ruin and populations trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. The frozen city began to thaw with the coming spring, revealing layers of destruction that had been hidden beneath the snow. Margaret remained with the 47th Battalion through the transition from combat to occupation duties. Captain Reeves offered her discharge when the immediate danger passed, but she declined. She had nowhere else to go, no life to return to. The military had become her purpose, the rifle her only remaining connection to meaning. She continued sniping duties, though the targets now were scattered holdouts and insurgents rather than organized military forces. The work was sporadic and unfulfilling, but it kept her occupied. It kept her from thinking too much. 6 months after Daniel's death, Harrison approached her with an offer. He was being transferred to a specialized reconnaissance unit and wanted her to come with him. The pay was better, the missions more challenging, the operational scope global rather than local. "You're wasted here," he said. "This battalion is transitioning to police duties. You're a combat asset, not a peacekeeper." Margaret considered the offer while standing on the roof where she had conducted her first hunt. The city spread below her, still damaged but showing signs of recovery. People were returning to their homes. Businesses were reopening. Life was asserting itself despite everything. She thought about Daniel and what he would want for her. He had been gentle, scholarly, someone who valued life and learning above all else. He would probably want her to put down the rifle, to find some way back to the person she had been before the war. But that person was gone, buried in the frozen ground along with Daniel's body. What remained was someone shaped by cold and loss, someone who had discovered a terrible proficiency for dealing death from a distance. "I'll think about it," she told Harrison. That night, she visited Daniel's grave for the first time since his burial. The cemetery was a new addition to the city's landscape, endless rows of markers for soldiers who had fallen during the defense. His stone was simple, bearing only his name, rank, and dates. Margaret knelt beside it, one hand resting on the cold marble. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "I've become something you wouldn't recognize, something I don't recognize. Everyone respects me now, but only because I'm good at killing. Is that enough? Is that what I'm supposed to be?" The stone offered no answers. The dead rarely did. She stayed until dawn, watching the sun rise over the damaged city, feeling the first real warmth in months. Spring was coming. Change was inevitable. Margaret made her decision. She accepted Harrison's offer and left the frozen city behind. Over the following years, she became one of the military's most effective snipers, operating in conflicts across 3 continents. She accumulated a record of confirmed kills, that made her legendary in certain circles and reviled in others. She never remarried, never formed close attachments. She remained solitary, professional, and lethally effective. The soldiers she worked with respected her abilities, but found her emotionally distant, untouchable in some fundamental way. Because part of her had frozen to death on that rooftop, aiming down at the men who killed her husband. The rest was just carrying out the logical conclusion of that moment, mission after mission, year after year. The battalion that had once mocked her held an annual memorial service for their fallen. Daniel's name was always read, always remembered. But so was Margaret's, not as dead, but as lost. The invisible woman who had appeared from nowhere saved them all and then vanished back into the margins of history. Stories circulated about her, some true, many embellished. She became a legend in military circles, the ghost of the frozen city, the sniper who never missed, the woman carved from ice and grief. Margaret heard these stories sometimes and found them darkly amusing. People needed legends, needed to believe in exceptional individuals who transcended normal limitations. It made the chaos of war feel more manageable, more purposeful. The truth was simpler and sadder. She was just someone who had lost everything and found that she had a particular skill for dealing death from a distance. No grand destiny, no higher purpose. Just a woman who kept moving forward because stopping meant confronting a grief too enormous to face. Years later, when she finally retired, Margaret returned to the frozen city one last time. The place had transformed completely, rebuilt, modernized, its war wounds faded, if not entirely healed. The transit station where she had lived with Daniel was now a museum, the tunnels converted into historical exhibits about the siege. She visited anonymously, walking through displays that cataloged the battle's progression. There was a section dedicated to the sniper who had defended the battalion. Her story, sanitized and simplified, presented as heroic rather than tragic. A photograph showed the target building from the North Sector, now restored, with a plaque marking the historical significance of the engagement where 9 enemy combatants were eliminated by a single marksman. No mention of Daniel, no mention of grief or loss or the personal cost of those 9 deaths, just tactics and strategy and military efficiency. Margaret stood before the display for a long time, then moved on to find the cemetery. Daniel's grave was still there, maintained by the city's memorial services. The stone had weathered but remained legible. She knelt beside it again, decades after her first visit. "I'm done," she said. "No more missions, no more killing. I thought it would get easier, but it never did. Every target was just another person, and taking them away from the world never brought you back." The wind, no longer bitter but carrying the warmth of summer, stirred her hair. "I don't know if you'd be proud of what I became. Probably not. You always saw the best in people, believed in building things rather than destroying them. I went the other direction." She placed flowers beside the stone-white roses, his favorite. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the person you thought I was. I tried, but the cold got inside me, and I couldn't get it out." Margaret stayed until sunset, then rose and walked away. She didn't look back. Some graves are meant to be visited once and then left behind. The frozen city continued its life, indifferent to one woman's grief or the ghosts that haunted its rebuilt streets. Winter would come again, as it always did, bringing snow and cold and the memory of darker times. But spring would follow, as it always had. And somewhere between those seasons, between remembering and forgetting, between the living and the dead, there was a space where Margaret existed, neither the woman she had been nor the legend others had created, but something in between. Someone who had survived, someone who carried Daniel's memory not as a burden, but as a quiet companion, a reminder of what had been lost and why it mattered. The city's towers caught the last light of day, their windows reflecting gold and crimson, beautiful despite everything. Margaret turned toward the train station, toward whatever came next, carrying her rifle case and a lifetime of shadows. Behind her, the cemetery settled into evening quiet. Daniel's stone stood silent among thousands of others, marking a life that had ended too soon and the ripples of consequence that followed. The war was over. But some battles never truly end. They simply become part of who we are, woven into our souls like scars that never fully heal. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps survival itself was a kind of victory, however hollow it might feel in the depths of night when memory came calling. Margaret boarded her train and left the frozen city for the last time, carrying all of this with her, the grief, the guilt, the cold that never entirely left her bones. The sun set, the city darkened, and in the shadows between buildings, in the spaces where snow had once accumulated and gunfire had echoed, there remained only silence, the kind of silence that follows when all the words have been spoken and all the debts have been paid. The silence of ending.